On the afternoon of September 14th, 1985, 68-year-old widow Margaret Wilson left her Jacksonville home to pick up a few groceries. By 6 p.m., her Toyota Camry sat abandoned in the parking lot of Sunshine Market. The bread and milk were still inside, but Margaret was gone. Police searched the area, but there were no signs of a struggle, no fingerprints, and no clear witnesses. One shopper claimed she saw Margaret talking to a tall man in a blue shirt near her car. Another swore a white van was parked close by. But none of it led anywhere. Within days, suspicion shifted to the people closest to her. Her only daughter, Linda, admitted to long-running arguments over selling the family home. She had an alibi for part of the evening, but not all of it. For years, she carried the weight of being called the prime suspect. At the same time, whispers spread about a local bingo club owner, Raymond Lopez. Rumors of debts and threats made him the second target of suspicion. His business collapsed, and his reputation never recovered. For nearly a decade, the case sat cold. Margaret's name was printed each year in lists of Florida's unsolved disappearances. Linda lived under a cloud of doubt. Raymond left town. The file collected dust. Until May 1994, when construction crews widening I-95 unearthed a leather handbag. Inside were Margaret's ID, her glasses, and her keys. Nearby lay skeletal remains bound at the wrists. Forensic analysis confirmed the impossible to ignore. This was no disappearance by choice. It was a crime, hidden in plain sight for 9 long years. The discovery reignited the case, exposed the truth, and forced the community to face how easily 2 innocent lives had been destroyed by suspicion. If this case has already pulled you in, don't stop here. In the next part, we'll step back and uncover who Margaret Wilson really was, the life she lived, the people close to her, and why her disappearance shook Jacksonville to its core. Stay with us and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think happened in that parking lot? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of this cold case. At 3:30 p.m., Margaret left her modest home in the Arlington area, driving her silver 1982 Toyota Camry. She planned only a short trip to Sunshine Market, less than 10 minutes away. For her, this was routine. She had a short shopping list, and she almost always went alone. Neighbors later told police that she looked calm when she pulled out of the driveway, wearing her usual light cardigan and carrying her brown leather handbag. By 4:17 p.m., she had finished shopping. The store's security camera caught her leaving through the sliding doors. In one hand, she carried a plastic bag with a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. She did not appear hurried. She walked directly toward the rows of parked cars. This was the last confirmed footage of her alive. At around 4:25 p.m., a woman who had just loaded her own groceries told investigators she noticed Margaret near her Camry. She was speaking with a man she did not recognize. He was described as tall, wearing a blue button-up shirt, and standing close to her. The witness said nothing seemed violent, but she remembered thinking it was unusual to see an older woman speaking with a stranger in that lot. By 6 p.m., another shopper noticed the Toyota still sitting in the same space. Something felt off. The groceries were still inside the vehicle, bread and milk sitting neatly in the bag. The driver's seat was empty. The engine was cold. Margaret was gone. When investigators searched the car, they found several details that made the scene deeply unsettling. Her purse, identification, and car keys were missing. There were no signs of a struggle inside or around the vehicle. No broken glass, no blood, no drag marks. It was as if she had walked away voluntarily, but everyone who knew her said that was impossible. At home, her daughter Linda had been expecting her. She began calling the house phone repeatedly around dinner time. There was no answer. Hours passed. By 7 p.m., panic took over. Linda contacted Jacksonville police and reported her mother missing. Officers arrived at Sunshine Market shortly after, securing the Camry and canvassing the area. That night, patrol units' witness accounts offered little clarity. One woman swore she had seen a white van idling in the lot around the same time Margaret disappeared. Another insisted she saw nothing unusual. Some remembered the tall one of the blue shirt, but no one could a license plate or a clear descriptor. The store cameras were too limited, capturing only the sliding doors and check aisles. The parking lot itself had no surveillance coverage in 1985. Detectives pressed every lead. They interviewed employees, nearby businesses, and anyone who had visited Sunshine Market that evening. Still, the timeline had a gap that no one could fill. Margaret at 4:17. She was seen to someone at 4:25. She was gone. This gap of less than 2 hours became the core mystery. How could an old woman, carrying nothing but groceries, vanish from a crowded lot while leaving behind her car and her food? By the end of the week, rumors began to spread. Some neighbors wrote about tensions between Margaret and her daughter, Linda. Others looked toward her club, where she was known to gamble modestly and sometimes lose. The police had little evidence, but the answers fueled suspicion. The disappearance shook Jacksonville. People who had felt shopping at Sunshine Market now looked over their shoulders walking to their cars. Elderly women asked relatives to accompany them on errands. Grocery store managers increased security patrols. Had begun. She spent the days in questions for police, defending herself against whispers, and by phone for news that never came. Margaret vanished into thin air, and there was no sign of where she had gone or who had taken her. Weeks later, the case to cool. Without witnesses, without evidence, and without a body, with nothing to move forward. On that September evening, the stage was set for one of Florida's most haunting cases. Margaret Maggie Wilson was born in 1917 in Jacksonville, Florida. She came from a working-class family, lived her entire life in the same city, and never left the familiar neighborhoods where she grew up. People knew her as steady, reliable, and easy to recognize at church or the local market. She was not a woman who chased change. She built her life on routine and community. Her marriage lasted for decades until 1979, when her husband died of a heart condition. That loss forced her into a new reality, living as a widow, sharing her days only with her daughter, Linda Wilson. The two women lived together in a modest home built in the 1950s. It was the family house, and it carried memories of Maggie's husband and the life they had built. That home became a point of conflict in later years. But in 1985, it was still where Maggie felt safest. Maggie had worked for many years as a clerk at the local courthouse. The job suited her reputation. She was careful, punctual, and respected for her accuracy. The courthouse staff remembered her as someone who rarely made mistakes, someone you could trust to keep records straight. After retiring, she carried that same disciplined lifestyle into her personal life. She was not wealthy, but she was stable, and she had no history of debt or crime. In her daily routine, Maggie stayed active in the community. She attended church every week, played bingo at the nearby club, and was often seen cooking or baking for her neighbors. She liked to share meals and was generous with her time. Many residents of Jacksonville remembered her kindness long after she disappeared. Despite being 68 years old in 1985, Maggie was healthy. She had no major illnesses, no chronic conditions, and no limitations that stopped her from driving or shopping alone. She owned a silver 1982 Toyota Camry and used it for errands almost every day. Her independence gave her confidence, and she insisted on maintaining it. Friends described her as gentle and helpful. She enjoyed conversation, always greeted others politely, and rarely raised her voice. This reputation made... There were also whispers from the bingo club. Some players said Maggie sometimes lost more money than she admitted. A few suggested she owed small amounts, though never anything significant enough to be considered dangerous. She had no loans, no mortgage issues, and no criminal background. Still, in the absence of answers, these details later became points of suspicion. Maggie had habits that everyone recognized. She always carried a small brown leather handbag and a rosary. These items were never left behind, and friends told police that if Maggie had them with her, she had not planned to leave town or disappear voluntarily. On the week she vanished, she had appointments set with both her doctor and her church. Everything in her life suggested continuation, not escape. The core fact remained: Maggie had no reason to walk away. She had roots in her community, a daughter at home, and daily routines that kept her grounded. She had responsibilities waiting in the days ahead. That is why her disappearance immediately stood out. She did not fit the profile of someone running from debt or hiding from trouble. When police reviewed her background, they found nothing alarming. No hidden accounts, no secret relationships, no criminal history. She lived quietly and consistently. This profile became the foundation of the investigation. If Maggie did not leave on her own, then someone must have taken her. This conclusion shaped the case from the start. Detectives compared her life to the evidence in the parking lot of Sunshine Market. Her car was left behind with groceries still inside. Her handbag, her identification, and her keys were missing. There were no signs of a struggle. The circumstances pointed to someone approaching her suddenly and leading her away, either through deception or force. The mystery of her disappearance gained strength precisely because of who she was. Maggie was not reckless, not secretive, and not unstable. Her life story made the case stronger, not weaker. It ruled out explanations that might have applied to someone else. She was reliable, she was predictable, and she vanished anyway. For investigators, her profile raised the stakes. If a woman like Maggie could disappear from a crowded grocery... Maggie's story is what gave the case weight. A widow, a mother, a longtime Jacksonville resident, a woman with strong ties to her neighborhood, no enemies, and no reason to leave. A woman who carried her rosary and her brown handbag everywhere. A woman who had just set medical and church appointments for the following week. She was stable. She was present. And then she was suddenly absent. That contrast The solid, ordinary life against the unexplained disappearance made the case unforgettable. Maggie Wilson's profile was not the background of someone destined for a mystery. It was the profile of someone who should have been safe, someone who should have returned home with bread and milk, and someone whose sudden absence left a community searching for answers that would not come for nearly a decade. By 7 p.m. on September 14, 1985, panic had already set in. Linda Wilson had been calling home for more than an hour, waiting for her mother to answer the phone. There was silence on the other end. Finally, she called Jacksonville police. Within minutes, officers were dispatched to Sunshine Market. They found Margaret's Toyota Camry sitting in the lot, untouched, groceries still inside. The car was carefully inspected. A loaf of bread and a carton of milk were still in a plastic bag placed neatly on the passenger's seat. Nothing looked out of place. There was no broken glass, no bent frame, no blood. The doors were locked. The driver's seat showed no signs of a struggle. But the strange details stood out immediately. Margaret's handbag was not in the car. Her wallet, identification, and keys were missing. Those items had vanished along with her. Police moved fast at first. They cordoned off the area and called for backup. A perimeter was set, 5 miles around Sunshine Market. Officers began canvassing the roads, bus stops, and entrances to I-95. Road patrols stopped vehicles, checking for elderly passengers or suspicious cargo. Flyers with Margaret's description were printed overnight and distributed at gas stations and diners. A K-9 unit was brought to the scene. The dogs picked up Margaret.
Witnesses offered fragments, but nothing consistent enough to lock onto. A woman who left the store around 4:25 reported seeing Margaret standing next to her Toyota, speaking to a tall man in a blue shirt. He seemed relaxed, not threatening. She couldn't hear what was said, and the interaction didn't look violent. Another shopper claimed a white van had been parked nearby, but when pressed, the story became vague. No one remembered a plate number. No one saw Margaret enter another vehicle. The timeline narrowed to less than 2 hours, and yet it remained empty. Police called in volunteers. Dozens of Jacksonville residents gathered with flashlights and combed through neighborhoods, wooded areas, and drainage ditches near the market. Search parties worked into the night. They looked under bridges and along the banks of the St. Johns River. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a purse, not even the chain of her rosary that she always carried. The following morning, the case hit the press. Local papers ran bold headlines: "Widow disappears after grocery trip." Radio stations repeated the details on every broadcast. By noon, the entire city was on edge. Sunshine Market was crowded every weekend, and now it was the site of a vanishing that no one could explain. Police tried to reassure the public. They emphasized that leads were being followed, that every angle was under review. But residents began to criticize their work. Some questioned why the lot hadn't been secured sooner, why officers allowed shoppers to come and go freely even after Margaret's car had been discovered. Valuable evidence could have been trampled, tire marks erased before they were documented. Others asked why the market's cameras had never been expanded to cover the parking area, a security gap that seemed obvious after the fact. Within days, tips poured in. Some callers claimed they saw a man fitting the description of the blue-shirted stranger at another shopping plaza. Others swore they saw a van speeding away from Sunshine Market that afternoon. Detectives chased down every lead, but each one ended in disappointment. By the second week, investigators had interviewed nearly every employee at Sunshine Market. Cashiers remembered Margaret as polite, quiet, and carrying only a short grocery list. Baggers saw her leave the checkout line, but none noticed her entering another vehicle. The parking lot attendants, teenagers who managed carts, had gone home. In their reports, police admitted they were facing one of the strangest cases the city had ever seen. An older woman, well known in the community, disappeared in broad daylight, leaving behind her car and groceries. There was no crime scene, no witnesses who saw a struggle, and no clear suspect. Frustration grew inside the department. Detectives circled the same questions again and again. Had Margaret willingly spoken to someone she knew? Was she tricked into leaving with a stranger? Or had she been ambushed so quickly that no one noticed? None of these theories had supporting evidence. As weeks passed, the pressure mounted. Newspapers ran follow-up stories describing the investigation as stalled. Headlines shifted from sympathy to criticism. Some articles directly accused the police of losing control of the case, of letting the trail go cold in its most critical hours. Families in Jacksonville began questioning their own safety, asking if someone was targeting women in parking lots. By October, the initial urgency had drained. The 5-mile search radius had yielded no results. No ransom note arrived. No body was found. Patrols stopped canvassing the area around the market. The command post that had been set up in the Sunshine Market parking lot was dismantled. For Margaret's family, it was devastating. For investigators, it was another unsolved file in a growing stack. Still, fragments of the case haunted the city. Residents remembered the tall man in the blue shirt. They remembered the story of a white van parked too close to the Camry. They remembered the groceries left behind, but none of it added up to answers. By the end of the year, the disappearance of Margaret Wilson was already being called the most mysterious case in Florida of 1985. And the truth was that investigators had nothing solid. No arrests, no charges, no real suspects. The investigation had run into a wall within weeks. Critics said the police failed Margaret in those early hours. They hadn't sealed the lot quickly enough. They hadn't preserved possible tire impressions. They hadn't pushed hard to gather more camera footage from nearby businesses. In a case where minutes mattered, the response felt clumsy. For Linda Wilson, after weeks with no solid lead from the supermarket lot, the investigation shifted. Detectives turned inward toward the only close relative still in Jacksonville, Linda Wilson, Margaret's 35-year-old daughter. On paper, the logic was simple. When cases stall, you start with the people closest to the victim. In practice, it meant pulling apart a strained mother-daughter relationship and asking if an ordinary family dispute had crossed an invisible line. Neighbors had already supplied a storyline. Several reported hearing loud arguments in the months before the disappearance. Some said the fights lasted an hour or more. The topic was always the same: the house. Linda wanted to sell the aging family home and move to a quieter neighborhood. Margaret refused. The walls held a lifetime of memories. To her, selling felt like erasing. Detectives wrote it down as a motive: pressure, frustration, and a possible financial benefit from selling the property. On the day of the disappearance, Linda worked the afternoon shift at a nail salon 5 miles from Sunshine Market. Payroll records and the salon's appointment book put her on duty from 2 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. Colleagues remembered her serving customers and sweeping floors. The timeline looked solid, until investigators found a gap. Between 4:35 and 5:05 p.m., no client was signed in, and no coworker could clearly place Linda at a station. It was only 30 minutes, but it was enough to raise questions. Detectives mapped the drive time from the salon to Sunshine Market, 10 to 12 minutes with light traffic. It was possible, they said, for Linda to make the trip, meet her mother in the lot, and return without drawing attention. Police pressed hard on that window. They pulled the salon's phone records. A call from the shop to the house went out at 5:11 p.m., lasting 30 seconds. Linda said she dialed to remind her mother to preheat the oven for dinner. There was no answer. Detectives saw something else, a nervous check-in and the start of a constructed timeline. They asked why she didn't call again right away. Linda said she had a walk-in client at 5:15. The appointment book showed a name. Detectives searched the house with Linda's consent. They photographed every room, opened closets, tested a few dark stains that turned out to be coffee. No sign of a struggle, no broken items, no recent repairs. The laundry machines were warm, a load had just finished. They took the lint trap, bagged a pair of rubber-soled flats, and swabbed door handles for prints. Nothing linked to a crime. They checked the garage. Linda's own car, a used sedan, showed routine wear, trunk liner intact. No fibers or residues that suggested a hasty cleanup. They worked the paper trail. The Wilson home had one joint checking account. Deposits came from Linda's wages. Routine payments covered utilities, church donations, and groceries. There were no large withdrawals. No life insurance policy matured by the disappearance, and no sudden purchases. If there was a financial motive, it didn't appear in the bank. Detectives noted something else. The house title listed both names. A sale would require mutual consent. That cut the value of the theory, but it didn't eliminate it. Police also examined the timeline from another angle. Could Linda have coordinated with someone else? Phone logs from the house and salon showed only ordinary calls. No payphone spikes. No late-night unknown numbers. Detectives canvassed the immediate circle. A few church friends, a cousin in another county, the salon owner. Everyone described Linda as impatient about the house but devoted to her mother's day-to-day needs. No one reported threats, plans, or violent talk. The statements from neighbors remained the strongest piece for the family dispute theory. One neighbor described a fight 3 weeks before the disappearance when voices carried onto the sidewalk. "Sell the place and be done," a woman had said. Another remembered Margaret replying, "Over my dead body." The words landed hard in the report. Linda told detectives it was a figure of speech, nothing more. The line stayed in the file anyway, highlighted and underlined, proof that tempers had boiled. Interviews with Linda grew longer. Detectives repeated the same questions, testing for cracks. At what exact time did you sweep the salon floor? Who saw you on your break? Why did you call the house at 5:11 and not again at 5:20? Why didn't you drive to Sunshine Market once your mother didn't answer? Linda's answers did not change. She thought her mother had stopped to talk with a friend or church acquaintance. She expected the front door to open at any moment. By 6:30, when her shift ended and the house was still dark, fear replaced routine. She called police at 7 o'clock. The department weighed a polygraph. Linda agreed. Results were inconclusive, too much stress, the examiner said. Investigators could not use the test in court, but the ambiguity kept the spotlight on her. More headlines followed. Extra copies of the evening paper sold out whenever the case appeared above the fold. Detectives asked the nail salon owner to reconstruct the afternoon minute by minute. The business had no cameras. The cash register produced totals, not timestamps. Staff remembered a steady flow, then a lull, then a small rush before closing. No one remembered Linda leaving the building for a 30-minute stretch, but no one could swear that she did not step out to the alley for air. That was the problem. Absence of proof, not proof of absence. The 30-minute gap stayed open. A small break seemed possible when a man told police he saw two women arguing near a silver car around 4:40 p.m. in the Sunshine Market lot. He couldn't identify them. He thought one might be younger with dark hair, He was not sure. It was enough to send detectives back to Linda with sharper questions. She denied being there. She described her uniform that day, pale. The longer the focus stayed on family, the less attention went to other possibilities. The tall man in the blue shirt faded into a vague description on a crowded bulletin board. The white van sighting sat in a pile of tips. Patrols narrowed to drive-bys. The command post at the market closed. When strategies were reviewed, the family-first approach made sense. It always made sense, until it didn't. By late fall, prosecutors reviewed the file for potential charges. They found none. No physical evidence placed Linda at the lot. No witness could say she entered or approached Margaret's car. No financial trigger was evident. The 30-minute alibi gap was troubling, but a gap is not a crime. The state declined to present the case to a grand jury. Investigators kept the file open, but momentum had died. The damage, however, was done. At the salon, clients watched Linda as if the answer to the mystery might show on her face. Friends stopped calling. Church acquaintances kept a polite distance. People she had known for years spoke in careful sentences, afraid of choosing a side in public. She carried the label without a charge, a suspect without a warrant, an answer to a question no one could actually prove. At home, Linda cooked for one, closed curtains early, and turned away from the front windows when cars slowed. She still dialed her mother's number out of habit, even though the phone on the kitchen wall would only ring into silence. She kept a copy of the police report by the table, the pages curling at the corners from use, the time entries underlined in blue ink. Each entry felt like a judgment. 4:17 p.m., footage of Margaret leaving the store. 4:25 p.m., a conversation in the lot. 6 p.m., the Camry found with groceries inside. 7 p.m., the missing person call. The same clock, the same city, and a daughter trapped inside its suspicion. By winter, the investigation into Linda had produced nothing that could survive a courtroom. But reputations do not wait for verdicts. The case had hardened public opinion. Either she knew more than she said, or she was a woman crushed by a story she could not control. The police moved on to other angles, but the shadow remained, and it would follow her.
The focus on Linda Wilson was starting to wear thin. Detectives had pushed her alibi, questioned her co-workers, even examined her bank records. Still, nothing tied her to the parking lot where her mother vanished. With no arrest in sight, they turned their attention outward, into the community where Margaret spent most of her free time. That led them straight to the bingo hall. The Sunshine Bingo Club sat on the corner of Hypers and Cherry. It was a modest place. Fluorescent lights, rows of folding chairs, the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke. For years, Margaret had gone there twice a week. She wasn't a high-stakes player, but it gave her a sense of routine, and she knew most of the regulars by name. Presiding over the hall was Raymond Lopez, 52 years old, a Cuban immigrant who had lived in Jacksonville since the late 1960s. He was described as friendly, strict about the rules, and always dressed in pressed shirts. When police asked around, a rumor quickly surfaced. Some players claimed Margaret had been unlucky in recent months, losing more than she could afford. A few even said she owed small amounts, $5 or $10 at a time, and had delayed paying Raymond back. Stories grew with each retelling. One member swore they overheard Raymond telling her to settle up soon. Another said Margaret left the club looking worried. It wasn't hard to imagine that debt and pressure might have caused tension. Detectives noted it carefully. Margaret disappeared with her purse missing, her wallet gone. Was she targeted because of something as simple as a bingo debt? Raymond was summoned to the station. He didn't resist. He arrived in a plain blue jacket, calm, but visibly offended. He told investigators that the idea was absurd. Yes,
Margaret played regularly. Yes, sometimes she lost. But no one at the club played for stakes that mattered. Bingo debt, he said, isn't the kind of thing people kill for. It's a few dollars, nothing more. He denied ever threatening her, denied any argument, and said he had no reason to harm her. Police still weren't satisfied. They returned with a warrant to search the bingo hall. Officers combed through the back office. They pulled ledgers, receipts, and scrap paper. The fallout was immediate. Attempts at the club dropped sharply. Where once 40 players filled the hall, now barely 15 showed up. Some members didn't want their names linked to a place under investigation. Others feared being questioned by police. By November, half the weeknight sessions were canceled. For Raymond, the damage went beyond business. At the supermarket, people avoided his line. Neighbors stopped waving. His children, both in high school, were taunted in the halls. "Your father killed that old lady," classmates sneered. The stigma spread faster than any investigation could contain. Detectives called him in a second and third time. They asked about his whereabouts on the afternoon of September 14th. Raymond said he was at the club preparing for the Saturday evening session. He had been there from 2 o'clock until 8 o'clock p.m., with staff and players present. Several employees confirmed his account. Still, investigators pressed. Could he have left for 30 minutes? Could he have driven to Sunshine Market, less than 15 minutes away? Raymond shook his head. He said he never left the building. Police couldn't disprove it, but they couldn't prove it either. The alibi wasn't airtight. There were moments when staff were busy calling numbers, when no one kept track of his movements. That gray area was enough to keep suspicion alive. By December, the bingo theory had taken hold in the city's imagination. Talk radio hosts speculated about an unpaid debt. Editorials painted Raymond as a stern club owner with a temper. Even though there was no physical evidence, no eyewitness linking him to Margaret in the parking lot, the idea of a confrontation over money seemed believable to many. Behind closed doors, investigators admitted the theory was weak. Bingo debts didn't add up to a motive for kidnapping and murder. No forensic link tied Raymond to the Camry, the groceries, or the missing purse. But without new leads, the case was running dry. And in a vacuum, rumor thrived. Raymond's life unraveled in slow motion. By early 1986, attendance had dropped so low that he shut the club down. The doors were locked, the lights turned off, the sign removed. His reputation, once built over decades, was gone. He packed up with his family. As weeks turned to months, the investigation into Raymond stalled. Detectives had nothing new to offer prosecutors. No one could testify that Raymond ever confronted Margaret about money. No one saw him near Sunshine Market that afternoon. And without evidence, no charges could be filed. By the end of 1985, Raymond remained in the file as Person of Interest Number 2. He would carry that title for years, his name connected forever to a crime he had no hand in. The bingo club theory showed how fragile reputations could be when cases stalled. A rumor whispered by a few regulars became a headline became a narrative destroyed a man's livelihood. And still, the mystery of what really happened to Margaret Wilson remained unsolved. The police had 2 prime suspects in the eyes of the public: Linda, the daughter with a family dispute, and Raymond, the club owner with rumored debts. Both were innocent. But in 1985, Jacksonville didn't know that. The case stood still, and suspicion swallowed 2 lives whole, leaving the real perpetrators free to vanish back into the shadows. By the start of 1986, the case of Margaret Wilson had gone cold. Nearly a year had passed with no new evidence, no solid leads, and no arrests. Detectives in Jacksonville moved her file into the growing shelf of unsolved disappearances. It was official. Margaret Wilson was now a cold case.
For her daughter Linda, that decision carried its own punishment. Though never charged, she remained the shadow suspect. Neighbors whispered. Customers at the nail salon watched her every move. Former friends kept their distance. A coworker later recalled, she was quiet, kept her head down. People didn't want to sit near her anymore. For almost a decade, she lived with the weight of being called the woman who killed her own mother. Raymond Lopez, the bingo hall owner, fared no better. In 1985, he had already lost players to rumor. By 1987, the hall was nearly empty. Families stayed away, convinced he had something to do with Margaret's disappearance. His business collapsed. He shut the doors for good, and the building sat vacant. At home, things unraveled. His children were mocked at school. His wife sank into depression. Raymond left Jacksonville, settling quietly in another town. His life as a respected local businessman was over. While reputations collapsed, the investigation stood still. Technology in the 1980s could not bridge the gaps. DNA analysis was still in its infancy. The grocery bag in the Camry, the car itself, the camera footage, none of it could be turned into a usable lead. Police had no fingerprints, no fibers, no blood. The file was boxed and stored in an evidence room. It gathered dust for years. Witnesses who might have helped slowly disappeared. A woman who said she saw Margaret with a man in a blue shirt moved out of state. Others passed away. By the early 1990s, the few who remained couldn't recall the details clearly. Memory faded. Timelines blurred. Detectives admitted in private that the trail had gone cold beyond recovery. The press stopped caring. Each September, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a small mention appeared in the back pages of the local paper. Nothing more.
Police, meanwhile, faced criticism. Families in Jacksonville accused them of locking too quickly onto Linda and Raymond while ignoring other possibilities. Critics asked why the search around Sunshine Market hadn't been extended further, why cameras at nearby stores weren't checked, why no one looked harder into crimes along the highway. With limited resources, the department admitted the case had been sidelined. Trust between the community and investigators eroded year by year. By the early 1990s, the case was little more than a ghost. Younger residents of Jacksonville barely knew the name Margaret Wilson. Only a handful of neighbors, older church members, and family friends still spoke of her. To them, she was a reminder of how quickly a person could vanish, and how quickly a community could move on. Some even began to tell her story as if it were an urban legend, a ghost of Sunshine Market whispered to new families moving into the neighborhood. The cold years dragged on, with no sign of progress. For Linda, it was a decade of isolation. For Raymond, a decade of shame. For Margaret, it was silence. The truth remained buried, hidden under concrete, paperwork, and years of neglect. But in May 1994, everything changed. Road crews working on the expansion of Interstate 95 struck something unexpected underground. What they uncovered would blow the case wide open and drag it back into the headlines after nearly a decade. If you've followed the story this far, don't stop here. In the next part, we'll cover the shocking discovery that finally brought Margaret Wilson's name back into the spotlight. What do you think workers found that day? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to hear Part 7 of this cold case. It was May 1994, almost 9 years after Margaret Wilson vanished from the parking lot of Sunshine Market. Jacksonville was growing fast, and construction crews were sent to expand the lanes of Interstate 95. For most people in the city, Margaret's name had faded into memory. For her family, the silence had become unbearable. But that silence was about to break. One morning, as workers dug deep into the ground near the market's drainage system, a backhoe struck something unexpected. The bucket caught on what looked like a weathered piece of leather. At first, they thought it was trash buried under years of dirt. But when they pulled it out, they realized it was a handbag, worn and falling apart from years underground. Inside that handbag were items that stopped everyone in their tracks. A Florida identification card, a pair of thin, metal-rimmed glasses, a small key ring with Toyota car keys still attached. All belonged to one woman, Margaret Wilson. For investigators, this was the first direct piece of evidence linked to her since September 14, 1985. It was no longer just a story of a widow who disappeared after a trip to the grocery store. It was evidence that she had been taken, and her life had ended violently. Crews kept digging. Just a few yards from where the handbag was found, they uncovered human bones. The medical examiner was called immediately. The skeleton was confirmed to be that of an older female. The frame matched Margaret's height and build. Her dentures aligned with her dental records. There was no question anymore. This was Margaret. But the bones told more than identity. Forensic specialists examined the remains and found something chilling. The wrists carried deep marks, indentations that showed she had been bound with plastic restraints before she died. And the cause of death was no mystery. Margaret had not wandered away. She had not staged her own disappearance. She had been suffocated. This was homicide. The discovery made headlines across Florida. The story landed on the front page of the Florida Times-Union and quickly spread to national outlets. A case thought to be forgotten was back. The headline was blunt. The community of Jacksonville erupted with questions. How could a body and handbag sit in a drainage system less than a mile from the original crime scene for 9 years without anyone finding it? Why had the police not searched that area thoroughly back in 1985? The criticism was sharp. Editorials in the local paper asked how investigators could have missed something so close to the Sunshine Market. Residents began to lose trust in the competence of their police department. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office moved quickly to repair the damage. They reassigned the case to the Cold Case Unit, a team formed specifically to handle unsolved homicides. All original reports were pulled from storage. Evidence was re-examined. Witness statements were reviewed. For the first time in years, there was momentum. Detectives knew one thing. The old theories no longer held weight. The evidence of restraints and suffocation didn't fit the story of a family dispute. It didn't fit the whispers about bingo debts. This was organized, deliberate, and efficient. It was the work of criminals who had targeted Margaret for reasons beyond her personal life. But while the investigation was gaining speed, the Wilson family was left to process the reality of what had been uncovered. They held a prayer service at their church, thanking God that Margaret had finally been found. Neighbors who once doubted Linda attended, some offering apologies in quiet voices. For Linda, the pain of 9 years under suspicion did not vanish overnight, but she could finally say with proof that she had not harmed her mother. The discovery also reignited the community's interest in the case. People called into radio shows, debating whether the police had focused too narrowly on Linda and Raymond Lopez in the beginning. Some pointed out that if detectives had looked beyond family drama and bingo clubs, maybe Margaret's killers would have been caught years earlier. Cold case detectives began piecing together a new theory. Margaret had been taken from the parking lot, restrained, and killed nearby. Her killers had disposed of her body in the drainage system during the highway construction that was underway in the mid-1980s. Her car had been left behind as a decoy to mislead investigators. Everything about it suggested planning. By the summer of 1994, the case was officially reclassified from a missing persons file to a homicide. The sheriff held a press conference announcing the breakthrough. "We now know Margaret Wilson was murdered," he told reporters. "This was not an accident, and it was not voluntary. Someone is responsible, and we intend to find out who." The words reverberated across Jacksonville. For the first time, the city knew the truth. Margaret had been a victim, not a mystery. She had not vanished into thin air. She had been killed. And that truth reopened every old wound the case had left behind. But even as the community demanded answers, another question loomed larger. Who had done it? If not Linda, if not Raymond Lopez, then who? Cold case detectives began to shift their focus toward a new and darker possibility: organized street crime that had plagued Florida during the 1980s. The discovery in May 1994 marked the turning point. The years of silence were over. The case had new life, new direction, and new urgency. Jacksonville was about to learn that the truth behind Margaret Wilson's disappearance was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Cold Case Unit reopened the file in early spring after a lab found something everyone else had missed in 1994. The warehouse that stored the old evidence had been consolidated. Boxes were logged again. A technician pulled the tape from a small paper bag and ran it with newer chemistry. The adhesive held trace plastic consistent with mass-produced zip ties from the mid-1980s, not the fabric restraints patrol officers once assumed. That result mattered. It broke the last thread connecting the case to Linda Wilson and Raymond Lopez. Neither had access to commercial bundles of ties used by car theft crews at the time. The team filed the supplement and recommended a formal exclusion. Detectives briefed the family first. Then they called a press conference and cleared Linda and Raymond. No fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers, no purchase history, nothing on their cars, nothing in their homes. The suspicion that stained them came from arguments, rumors, and the kind of shortcuts that follow a stalled search. The new report shut that door. The case turned. Investigators started fresh. They walked the 1985 timeline minute by minute. Margaret parked at a Jacksonville supermarket on a humid Thursday afternoon. She bought staples. She rolled the cart out. A clerk remembered the paper bags. Another remembered the smile and the coupons. The cart was found near the sedan with the front wheel turned slightly left, as if she had paused to load and planned to push forward and steer at the same time. The groceries stayed in the cart. The driver's door was unlocked. Her keys were missing. The scene suggested speed. There were no calls for help that anyone remembered. One woman told police she heard a car door slam and then a second door. She did not see faces. She moved on. By the time anyone understood she was gone, the lot was full again. The unit pulled crime logs from 1983 to 1987 across Northeast Florida. They asked for robbery, abduction, stolen vehicles, and assaults of older women in parking lots. A pattern surfaced along Interstate 95. It centered on the team called the FBI liaison and requested archived intelligence from the Jacksonville resident agency. A name kept appearing in those files. A loose car theft crew that moved from Miami to Daytona to Jacksonville in 1984 and 1985. They used cheap zip ties to control hands. They favored older victims because they were less likely to fight and more likely to carry cash. Members drifted in and out. Arrests hit the edges of the group for burglary, forged titles, and narcotics. The core avoided long sentences by keeping the work quick and the witnesses quiet. Detectives mapped the crew's known sightings against the day Margaret vanished. 2 informant reports placed them in Jacksonville that month. A third said one member bragged about a lady at a market who went quiet fast. That tip never led to charges at the time. Now, paired with the forensic update and the MO, it carried weight. The unit requested interviews with anyone left alive. One man agreed to talk inside a prison chapel. He was 61 and on the last years of a sentence from another state. He said he used to ride with a driver named Rico and a heavy-set man named Cal. They watched parking lots. They timed their moves to the cart return. He described their method. One man blocked the view, the other moved in from the blind side. Zip ties came from a gray toolbox, bundled in hundreds. He talked about a job where the woman never screamed. He said they hid a body in a storm drain near an industrial park and drove away before the evening delivery trucks arrived. He claimed he wasn't there, then slipped and used "we." He asked for a transfer in exchange for more. The state declined a deal without corroboration.
The unit went back to the drain lines. Many had been replaced, repaired, or paved over. Records from Public Works showed a flood retrofit in 1992. Crews removed several sections and dumped debris without cataloging. The chance to recover remains from that exact spot was low. Still, teams surveyed with ground-penetrating radar. They found anomalies, but not human bone. The report noted that time, storms, and construction destroy traces that once would have answered everything. They tracked surviving victims from similar attacks. One woman in her 70s agreed to meet. She had been shoved into the back seat outside a pharmacy in 1985 and escaped when the men argued about her car alarm. She remembered the zip ties. She remembered the fast, practiced hands. She remembered in sour chemical smell from their van and a radio tuned to sports. She said they worked like they had done it many times. Her statement fit the method. It explained why no one heard Margaret call for help. There was no time to call. A hand over the mouth, a hard push, a quick drive. The unit developed a short list of men tied to the crew. Some were dead. One died in a wreck in 1989 in Georgia. Another died in prison in 1993. 2 vanished after parole and left no forwarding address. A 5th lived subpoenas for phone tolls and employment records. The paper trail was thin after so many years. A few old associates confirmed the crew had passed through Jacksonville, but no one would place anyone at the supermarket on the exact day. No fingerprints from the scene matched the short list. The only physical clue was the adhesive signature on the tape, and that proved method, not identity. Prosecutors met with detectives and walked through the file. They needed a witness who knows the abduction and could name a face, a confession that held up in court, or physical evidence that tied a living suspect to the lot, the restraints, or the body. There was none of that. The case was strong in pattern and logic and weak in proof. The state could not bring charges that might fail in front of a jury. The decision hurt, but
The department issued a written apology to both of them. The chief met them in a small room, not in front of cameras. He said the case leaned on the wrong people for too long. He said the new science made the difference, and if they had it then, things would have gone another way. He did not make excuses. He offered to help with record corrections and statements to employers and landlords. The moment did not bring peace, but it brought breath. The family of Margaret listened to every update. They heard about I-95, the van, the zip ties, the storms, the drains, the missing men. They knew the truth of how it likely happened. They knew why no one heard her. They understood how fast it had been. They faced something harder than a guilty verdict. They faced the fact that the people who took her were shadows pulled thin by time, and the system had few tools left to grab them. The unit wrote a final summary for the year. It removed Linda Wilson and Raymond Lopez from the suspect list and marked them as formally cleared. It added the car theft crew as subjects of interest. It noted that several were dead, and others likely living under new names. It described the evidence, the adhesive finding, the pattern of attacks, the corroborating victim statements, and the informant's partial admission. It also listed what they did not have: a body, a plate hit, a surviving witness with a face, a piece of property in a suspect's possession that belonged to Margaret. The state attorney signed the document, acknowledging the limitations. The press ran the story. The city saw how a simple trip to buy groceries had collided with a practiced criminal routine that stripped cars for parts and silenced witnesses when it suited them. The lesson was not comforting. It was practical and cold. Crime can be fast. Evidence can vanish. Time can sand down edges until nothing fits. Months later, the supermarket replaced the lighting in the lot and added more cameras. A plaque near a new tree carried Margaret's name. People left flowers. Linda and Raymond stood there one morning before sunrise. They did not speak much. They did not need to. Their names were clear. In September 1994, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office called the press into a crowded briefing room. After 9 years of doubt, rumors, and unanswered questions, investigators stood in front of the microphones and delivered their conclusion. Margaret Wilson had not walked away. She had not staged her disappearance. She had not been killed in a family dispute or over a bingo debt. She was the victim of a predatory street crime carried out by a roaming car theft crew that operated in Florida during the mid-1980s. The case was reclassified as homicide, offenders unresolved. That announcement should have brought relief, but it came with a heavy reminder. For almost a decade, suspicion had poisoned 2 innocent lives. Linda Wilson, Margaret's only daughter, had carried the label prime suspect from the day her mother vanished. She endured police interrogations, whispered conversations, and the quiet rejection of neighbors who assumed the worst. She lost friends, clients, and any sense of normal life. Raymond Lopez, who ran the bingo hall where Margaret spent her evenings, carried the same burden. He was accused of threatening her over small debts. Newspapers painted him as a shady operator who might have silenced an elderly woman. His business collapsed, his family was shunned, and his name was left in the gutter. Now, in that September briefing, both Linda and Raymond were formally cleared. Investigators removed their names from the file. Journalists rushed to capture the moment with headlines, "2 innocents cleared after a decade of suspicion." The truth was out, but the damage had already been done. Reputations do not recover as quickly as files can be corrected. The community reacted with shock. Jacksonville had lived with this case for 9 years, but most people believed it was a domestic tragedy. The new findings shattered that narrative. Residents realized they had turned on two locals without proof. Trust in the police eroded further. If detectives could spend years chasing the wrong people while the real culprits moved freely, what did that say about the system? Newspapers across Florida gave the story new life. They called it the parking lot widow case. Radio shows debated how a city could condemn innocent people. National outlets picked it up as an example of how rumors can destroy lives. For the Wilson family, the conclusion brought a bittersweet kind of closure. Linda organized a memorial at the church where her mother had worshipped. Friends, relatives, and neighbors gathered under the stained glass. They prayed, sang, and unveiled a small stone marker engraved with Margaret's name and the dates 1917 to 1985. It was a chance to honor her openly, something the family had not dared to do when suspicion still hung in the air. Linda stood near the marker, finally free from the accusations that had chased her for so long. She breathed easier, but the years lost to whispers and isolation could never be restored. The wound remained, but at least the cloud of guilt was gone. The police department faced its own reckoning. Detectives admitted that the early investigation leaned too heavily on gossip and circumstantial motives. They promised new procedures to prevent such mistakes. Cases would no longer focus on family members without physical evidence. Rumors from bingo halls or neighbor disputes would not outweigh forensic results. The cold case unit used Margaret's file in training sessions, teaching recruits that patience, technology, and objectivity were the only path to justice. Supervisors pointed to the DNA and adhesive analysis.
Security in Jacksonville changed too. Sunshine Market, where Margaret was last seen alive, installed new cameras across its parking lots. The city added lights, patrols, and emergency call boxes. Other supermarkets followed, unwilling to be linked to another tragedy. Crime prevention seminars cited the Wilson case as an example of how vulnerable parking lots could be, especially for older customers. The city council approved grants for safety improvements, and the local press tracked every update. Margaret's disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It was a reason for reform. The legacy of the case extended beyond safety measures. Margaret Wilson became a symbol of the forgotten victim, an ordinary woman erased by violence, whose story was nearly buried under false accusations. Linda Wilson, once seen as a suspect, was now a survivor of public suspicion. She gave occasional interviews, speaking not about her pain, but about the need for careful investigations. Raymond Lopez lived quieter, having left Jacksonville, but his name remained tied to the cautionary tale of what happens when rumor becomes evidence. Their experiences stood as a permanent reminder of the cost of investigative failure. As years passed, the story continued to echo. Crime historians noted the way time erases chances for justice. Students in criminology courses read about how forensic breakthroughs can rewrite entire cases, but too late to punish the guilty. The FBI cited the case in internal bulletins about the importance of tracking roaming crews who target vulnerable victims. Community advocates spoke about the need to protect the reputations of the innocent until evidence points clearly in one direction. For Jacksonville, the lesson was simple but painful. Margaret Wilson had walked out of a grocery store on a quiet afternoon, carrying bread and milk, and vanished into the hands of criminals who cared nothing for her life. She was silenced and hidden in a drainage system until construction workers stumbled across the truth. In the years that followed, her daughter and a neighborhood businessman carried the blame that should have been placed on strangers. By the time science cleared their names, the suspects were dead, scattered, or already behind bars for other crimes. Justice would never be complete. Yet, Even without a trial, the truth still mattered. The file was